Welcome, everybody. It's certainly nice to see so many familiar faces and, of course, new faces. My name is Dale Borglum. I'm the director of the Living Dying Project. Annie here needs no introduction to most of you, I'm sure. I will talk some, she will talk some, we'll have a conversation, and then there'll be time at the end for questions and answers. The Living Dying Project is about two things. It's about living and it's about dying, and primarily it's about the slash in the name between living and dying, how dying informs living and how living prepares for dying. I met Annie over the bedside of her best friend who was dying many years ago. How long ago? 15 years ago?
I think it was 92.
Okay, 18 years ago.
Yeah.
And then later we met over the bedside of a young baby who died before he was 2 years old.
When he was 3 months old. He was the infant.
Did I say 2 years or 2 months?
You said 2 years.
I meant 2 months. So it was actually, he lived
Maybe
through.
it was 2 months, yeah.
And so the Living Dying Project offers spiritual support for people who have life-threatening diseases. At the same time, the living part of the Living Dying Project is we have groups called Healing at the Edge that I facilitate. And at these groups, in fact, there are people here from the group in Berkeley, the group in Fairfax, and even up in Sebastopol.
Yeah.
Thomas Merton said, "Love and prayer are learned in the hour when prayer becomes impossible and the heart turns to stone." Whether I'm working with someone who is living or someone who is dying, that quote is completely appropriate. It really doesn't make much difference. In fact, that's almost the dirty secret of working with people who are approaching death, is that exactly the same work that will help you or I to be fully alive as we're sitting here together, going beyond the identities of I'm talking and you're listening, I'm up on the stage, you're down there on the floor, going beyond those identities and really touching that place where we are human beings rather than somebody is a cancer patient or somebody is a dying person or somebody is a helper or somebody is a doctor or somebody is the wise person. His Holiness the Dalai Lama says that the essence of compassion is the ability to equalize and then switch yourself with another person. And when one is with someone who is very, very ill and might be dying soon, it can be so easy to pull back and say, well, I'm not the dying person, I'm here to help, and not really be equal. And in fact, I think the books you write are so popular because you talk so lovingly about how you see the places in yourself where you're not equal with yourself. Mm-hmm. That often compassion is talked about, I'm going to be compassionate for the dying person. And when we do Eastern contemplative practices, almost always we start out saying, doing compassion practices for people who are sick, people who are poor, people who are suffering. And very seldom do we actually start out by doing compassion practices for ourselves. And we don't really look at those places in ourselves that are bringing us to practice in the first place. My guess is that if you had a friend who said the things to you about you that you say to yourself about yourself, that person wouldn't be your friend for very much longer. And that if in fact those thoughts you say about yourself are projected in the way that you can do in a very humorous and loving way, but if we really projected all that stuff, that people wouldn't want to get too close to us most of the time. Eastern contemplative practice is based on the assumption that the person who is practicing is a relatively unneurotic and happy person. And in fact, the Dalai Lama said the thing that surprised him most when he came to the West, and it took him 3 visits here, was that people here don't like themselves. So when one begins the process of disidentifying with places in ourselves where we're really caught in ego structure, and yet we're doing it from a neurotic foundation, it doesn't actually work too well. We create quite a mess, and I think we can all see that if we're honest enough. When a baby is born, if the birth goes relatively well, the first developmental stage that a baby goes through is learning to be grounded, lying down, then sitting up, then standing, then moving around. And yet when these practices that, when we begin those practices, it's assumed that we're grounded. And if in fact one comes to practice without being grounded, once again, it's very difficult to not get really lost in the process. When these practices were initially put together by the Buddha and by some of his disciples, people in Hindu schools, it was just assumed that somebody was grounded. That in those days, people were running around barefoot. People slept with their parents in their parents' beds until they were 7, 8 years old. People were really close to the ground, and yet that is not the case today. So when we're doing these practices where it's assumed that you're grounded, and then beyond that you are centered, which is the developmental stage that comes after somebody is grounded. Being grounded, being centered, then we can begin to go into the heart. But if one tries to go into the spaciousness of the heart without this foundation, then it can be pretty scary. The heart remains open only when one feels safe. Before we began tonight, Annie said to me, well, it looks like a group of people that are safe, sweet, and what was the other one?
Smart.
Smart. And it does look like a safe group, but at the same time, things come up in our lives where we don't feel so safe. How possible is it to keep your heart open when you don't feel safe? So rather than just plunging into some kind of contemplative practice, can we begin by getting really grounded, getting really centered, and then begin the work of the heart? Walt Whitman said, sometimes touching another human being is almost more than I can bear. You've had that experience. I've had that experience. And I would guess, though, that we've had that experience less often with ourselves. How often have you looked at yourself in the mirror, or how often have you seen your inner thoughts, felt what's going on in your life, and been so touched that it's almost more than you can bear? Now, if one is approaching death, or beyond that, if one is supporting someone who is approaching death, then that unbearableness of connection can be more clearly revealed. And in fact, the focus of the Living Dying Project is really not so much dying, but transformation of consciousness, growth, awakening in the context of looking at the possibility of dying in the near future. So it isn't really so much about dying, but the fact that you will die and I will die, and we don't know when we're going to die. We all assume that even though that moment is uncertain, that it's somewhere off far enough in the future that we don't really need to think about it tonight. Is there a way to open to our mortality in a way that instead of frightening us, really brings us to that unbearable quality of touching somebody else, touching ourselves, so that the love, the sense of presence that we feel is revealed, and we can even rest in that place. The most beautiful Americans I have ever been around are almost without exception people who are almost dead. Why is it that we have to wait until we only have so few breaths left before we are willing to be this radiant, completely wide open person? In Buddhism, there are things called the 4 mind-turning truths, that if we really take them deeply inside, that these truths will turn our mind toward opening to who we truly are. The first truth I've already briefly mentioned, and that is that you will die, but you don't know when. The second truth is that life is precious. We've all had those experiences of looking into the eyes of our child, of someone we deeply love, being in nature, hearing music, and being so deeply, deeply touched that we remember who we are. But the next mind-turning truth is there is suffering in this world, that we forget that sense of presence, we forget that connection. And we get lost in our neurotic structures. We get lost in distracting ourselves from that thing that we've touched that is so precious. And the last mind-turning truth is that what you do has an effect in this world. If we think, act, or speak with kindness, with generosity, with mercy for ourselves, for other people, it has one effect. If we act with greed, with fear, it has another effect. So, really at the center of this practice is compassion, which literally means with passion, with emotion. How much passion, how much openness can we bring to being with those places in ourselves where we aren't resting in the preciousness? We aren't resting in the preciousness of who we are. Once again, that Thomas Merton quote, "Love and prayer are learned in the hour when prayer becomes impossible and the heart turns to stone." So when you're at the beach and it's a perfect day and you're with somebody you love and there's a perfect sunset, maybe it's not so hard to have your heart open. But then suppose you go home and the next day you go to the doctor and the doctor says, "I've got some very, very bad news for you. You have cancer. There's not too much we can do about it." Or you find out that someone you love is very sick. Or we just look at the political, economic, social trajectory that the world seems to be on, the environmental trajectory that the world seems to be on. Can we look at those things and be warriors of compassion rather than getting lost in sadness, lost in despair about what it is that we see? I have been a meditation teacher for a long, long time, and I have to admit that I'm getting to the point where really my life is more about prayer than it is about meditation. That quote about love and prayer are learned in the hour when my heart turns to stone, that again and again that happens. And I used to be, in fact, I probably still am, a very addictive kind of person. And as I'm getting older and a bit more mature, the addictions aren't quite as destructive as they used to be. But I'm still addicted to excitement. I'm still addicted to trying to understand things all the time. And that obsession I used to have with drugs or with drinking or then with meditating kind of got lost when I finally got happy enough that I didn't need to meditate to just get by. When I was younger, I had some severe electrical shocks and almost got electrocuted a few times. It sort of fried my nervous system. And because of that, I was really uncomfortable in my body. So for many, many years, I meditated, trying to calm down and get back in my body. And when I finally did and started getting comfortable again, then I said, okay, well, now I can just sort of relax and walk on Mount Tam and enjoy myself. And somehow that's not working anymore. Somehow that obsession I'm learning to bring to that moment when my heart turns to stone. I'm trying to bring that obsession to praying, opening deeply enough so that I can touch that place with mercy, with kindness, with compassion, rather than trying to meditate it away or push it away or struggle it away. So later on tonight, I'll talk briefly about the groups that I'm facilitating. Part of the idea of the night here is I'd like to invite you to consider coming to one of these groups. There's one in Fairfax on Wednesday night. There's two in Sebastopol Tuesday afternoon and Tuesday evening, and one in Berkeley on Monday evening. And in fact, there are people here, I think, from all of those groups that you could talk to. I'll maybe have them stand up and smile at the end of the evening. And I'll let Annie speak for a while before we have a conversation.
And take questions. Do you want a cough drop?
Yeah, do you have one?
Yeah. I'm a woman. I have an entire medical emergencies bag with me. Aspirin, Benadryl. Here. Oh, those are good for your throat. Yeah.
Yeah, it's getting inflamed. I don't know. I feel like I'm sort of.
Yeah. Do you want some aspirin?
Actually, to be.
Well, that's good for swelling. Aspirin's good for everything.
Actually, what's going on is I'm on the 7th day of a cleansing fast, and my throat is getting all inflamed, and it's like, as I started talking, the left side of my throat started going like that.
Oh, well, I have lots of products.
Okay, well,
I have sewing stuff. Anybody gets a tear or rip, I have earplugs if you get bored. Lots of cough drops.
Boy, these things are potent, huh?
They really numb your throat. They're the best.
Drugs.
Anesthesia. Well, I was going to read something. We're going to, I think that one thing that everybody really loves is to be able to ask questions. And in my readings and what I do in the world, people just, I feel like they're wanting me to speed it up a little bit so we can get to the questions. But I just have written something I've been working on about grace in India, where so I'll just sort of read it and improvise a little bit, and then so I went to India in January. If you know me, you know I'm a very kind of nervous person. I love to be at home. I love to be around my animals. I have 2 dogs and a cat. I have a grandson now, Jax, who's almost 10 months old. I like to. One of the ways I've learned to do really radical self-love is to let myself have as many patterns and rhythms as I have, and not to make fun of myself for needing a lot of. I like things to be the same, so it's like good luck with that, since nothing ever is. But I take the dogs for a walk. I start my work at the same time. I don't really socialize. I have a couple friends I see on certain days. I love to read, like a lot of you. I was saved by reading at a 4 or 5, and so for me to say the words that I went to India are, I never thought I would, and I always wanted to be able to. My whole life I wanted to go to India. Anyway, it's a piece about grace. So I traveled to India in January, where I found myself on total overwhelm and absolute disbelief. And there was no sense of familiarity, or I have to ask you to say a word. Is it Saraswati, who's the goddess of learning? Does that sound right? Saraswati. Okay. Everything, there's not one single thing that is recognizable. I mean, they don't have M&Ms, right? That's how far out it is. They probably don't have Sepacol. And
They do in Delhi.
I was in Delhi. I was in Old Delhi, and I did not see any Sepacol.
New Delhi.
Yeah, they do in New Delhi.
No.
So just let that be a lesson. So Marin is just so mellow and sort of, I've lived here, I'm 56, and I've lived here for my entire life. And India, Old Delhi, and then Varanasi were just bursting, overflowing at the seams with craziness and life and the noise and the smells and the mess and the beauty and everything that could ever be anywhere all at once, except for the M&Ms. And my friend Bill, who I went with, who's a very flamboyant older guy who's been teaching languages and stuff in the Peace Corps, the most outrageous person I know. He said if I could ever get to India, he'd show me around. It was like a very safe bet since, I go to the movies Friday night and I go to church on Sundays, and it was a very safe bet, believe me. But he has been to Nepal, and he said there that there's a phrase called Rungi Chungi Chili Milli. Have you ever heard that?
Never.
Is that true? Rungi Chungi Chili Milli. And it means absolute total bombardment. And too much all at once of every color, every smell and taste and sound, and all the echoes that the world produces, and all the different forms of silence, some of which are so precious and some of which can be scary. And everything hot and spicy, and then candy made of sweet jelly, and harmonies and silence and horns all at once. And in Rungi Chungi Chili Milli, which I have known a lot in my life because I'm a human who has stayed alive, I have known overwhelm and I have known bombardment, much of it internal, and much of it during the 8 years of the last administration, and a lot of fearfulness about the environment and a lot of grief about having a baby now in this environment that just is so Rungi Chungi Chili Milli, just breaks your heart, So I was struck by where I always look for grace in a situation like that, and salvation, same thing. And even though it's almost never there in 56 years, most of which I've been a believer, I look for organization, and I love the illusion of momentary control. I like the light to be good. Like right now, I know this is fluorescent light, which is not my best light. And I love chocolate, but I don't like dark chocolate. So of course, I'm like the object of ridicule and disdain, since mostly you associate milk chocolate with children, and that's what I like. And I like recognizable chocolate. I have raging OCD, and it's fine. It's given me it really has been a portal to this great creative blessing. But it also means if I see a bag of M&Ms, I just feel safe and comfortable. A bag arrived in the mail today, and I just felt like flooded with divine love, and it